Okay, welcome, welcome, welcome. Sorry for the late start. Among other things, we were scrambling and looking for one of the Bibles that Patrice usually uses. And as you can see behind us, we got a whole bunch of Bibles back there, but none of those are the ones we were looking at, the ones that were next door. Unfortunately, not fortunately, the library is, at least the floor has been repaired from the flood, but with the shuffling of the books and shelves, could not find where the Bibles have now been relocated. So anyhow, that took us a little longer than anticipated.
Okay.
Let's launch by talking to God. Father, thank you that we can be here. Thank you that you brought us thus far, not only through this particular week, thus far this month, but through this part of your calendar. And as we anticipate a few more major events before the spring season concludes on your calendar, we want to remind ourselves yet again that you're the God who watches over us and with whom we walk, hopefully day by day, because you're certainly waiting for us to walk along with you. And so we pray that the time together this evening would be helpful helpful towards our walking with you in a more intimate way and in a more effective way in sharing our journey with you, with others around us. For this, we're grateful because of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, we have forgotten to do this the last couple times, so let's do it right this time. Are there any questions here? Nope. Okay. Are there any questions for those of you who have joined us live streaming?
Quiet.
Nope.
Very quiet.
Okay, then we will launch into the questions that have been sent to us, and it's quite an interesting mix of questions. Okay.
Some easier than others.
Yes. And the question goes like this. I have read different material about people that have one parent that is Jewish. For example, in my situation, my father's side was Orthodox Jewish, and my mother's father was Jewish, but my mother's mother was Catholic. One article I read that a rabbi wrote said that in the Torah, that the lineage is through the father, not the mother. What is your interpretation of this common question? In other words, we're going to start off with a real easy question. Who's a Jew? Well, actually, at one level, it is, while fairly complex, somewhat simple. A Jew is one who is either born Jewish or converts to Judaism. The question then becomes, as this questioner asked, who is considered one as having been born Jewish? Well, that depends on who you're asking. I somewhat hesitate to start here, but I'm going to start here anyhow. During the Second World War, if you had one Jewish grandparent that qualified you for the concentration camps, didn't matter which grandparent it was, one qualified you for the concentration camps. That may, given our history, I would say that should certainly be a considered qualifier. Because if you were, how should I put it, qualified to die because you're Jewish, then we ought to certainly consider you as part of the community. And that's my own particular, how should I put it, idiosyncrasy. And part of that may come as a result of my family, my parents having gone through the Holocaust, and I myself have being born in Budapest, Hungary, and coming over here immediately after the Holocaust. To do it on a more theoretical level, in virtually, if not all Jewish communities today, if your mother is Jewish, you are considered Jewish. How that came to be the main criterion for Jewishness, I'm not exactly certain. Some have posited that during the time of the Roman Empire, if you had a child, you certainly knew who the mother was because of the nature of the Roman Empire and the occupation. You might not always know who the father was. Whether that was the reason this came to be one of the main qualifiers, I'm not sure, but it is certainly one of the things that's out there. In the Bible, as the questioner pointed out, the how did he put it? The lineage goes through the father. In other words, who you are tribally connected with in biblical times, Second Temple period, and thereafter. If your father was from a certain tribe, then you were from that particular tribe. The person who is asking the question is in a very interesting situation because on his father's side, both parents are Jewish, in fact, Orthodox. On his mother's side, his grandfather is Jewish, but his grandmother is not. According to the most strict interpretations, that would mean that he is not technically Jewish because his mother was not technically Jewish because his mother's mother was not Jewish.
It depends on who you ask.
Yeah. So here's someone who is 3/4 Jewish, but in parts of the Jewish community would not be considered Jewish because the mother was not Jewish. If I remember, still in Israel today, that's the way it's determined. If your mother is Jewish, you are considered Jewish.
I believe so.
And I think as well that if your father's Jewish, it may qualify you for Israeli citizenship, but not necessarily for identification as a Jew. That's my recollection. It's been a long time since I've looked at that.
Yes, we're not up on maybe the
we're not
most modern decisions.
Yeah, there may have been some variations on that.
This is a kind of thing that is brought before the Israeli Supreme Court to decide.
These kind of
We've
things.
known personally people who have gone before that to decide if they're Jewish. In all situations, I would say though, if your mother or your father is not Jewish, it really does matter when you're an adult, whether you were raised in a Jewish household or you were raised in a Christian household. If you were raised in a Jewish household and just one of your parents was Jewish, I think that really adds some weight and they're more likely to accept your situation. Whereas if you're raised in a Christian home, maybe not so much.
Now, in today's version of Judaism, in Orthodox Judaism, your mother has to be Jewish for you to be considered Jewish. In Reform Judaism, if your father is Jewish, you are considered Jewish. I'm not sure where conservative Judaism is at this particular point. Oh, in Reform Judaism, either parent, be real clear, either parent qualifies you as being Jewish. I'm not sure exactly where conservative Judaism stands in that particular issue at this particular point in time. I apologize for not having that information right at hand. Within Messianic Jewish circles, the tendency is to accept anyone who has either parent as a Jew, than to accept that person as Jewish.
As long as that person wants to self-identify as Jewish.
Exactly. And in certain parts of Messianic Judaism, the idea of self-identification is extremely important. So I don't know if there's much more that we need to say about that, but the stress on self-identification has always been very, very important. So I would say to anyone who has just one Jewish parent, as Patrice said a few minutes ago, if you self-identify as a Jew, then
you act like one.
Yeah. In other words, if you live as a Jew and you associate yourself with the traditions as part of your life, then you're considered Jewish.
I was just going to say something we used to use when I was an advisor at University of South Florida was if somebody arrested you for being Jewish, could they prove that you are Jewish? And if they could, then congratulations,
You're a Jew.
you're Jewish. But if they arrest you for being a Jew and you don't do anything Jewish except maybe eat bagels, then you're not going to be convicted of being Jewish. So people who throw around their status, they need to back it up with what they do.
Yeah. Many years ago, our son had his own answer to this particular question.
Oh, do tell. I don't
remember?
this little.
He said, and I'm just summarizing where he was coming from at that time. We haven't talked about it since then. He said he didn't care who your mother or your father is or who your grandparents were. If you lived as a Jew, you're a Jew.
We had a boss back when we worked in Chicago, and he said he could foresee the time when being Jewish would be so unpopular that anybody who wanted to identify with the Jewish people and wanted to become part of the Jewish people, they're in. Anybody, as long as they were willing to be considered among the community of Jews. And I back then, I thought that was a little radical, but on the other hand, I somehow see how that works nowadays.
Yeah. And that perspective, in addition to what our son said, well, let's name our son, Seth. In addition to what Seth said, becomes, I think, even more vital in our day and age with the rise of anti-Semitism.
Yeah, that's what I said,
Yeah, I think I wanted to underline that, yes. So everyone's clear about that. With the rise of anti-Semitism, yeah. The lifestyle issue and the self-identification issue become very, very significant, very important. Seems like I was going to say one more thing, but I can't remember what that one more thing was. Oh, I know what it was. Is it worth throwing in a couple sentences here about God-fearers?
No.
Okay. Okay, so we'll leave that.
It just muddies waters.
Okay. So, and our particular community, our synagogue community, we welcome both Jews and Gentiles as part of our synagogue. Basically anyone who wants to identify with us and be part of the synagogue and operate from within a Jewish traditional perspective, you're welcome to be part of our community. That doesn't make you Jewish unless you are, but you're certainly welcome to be part of our community. And you are accepted at any and all levels.
I think, though, we should say about what our opinion is about conversion.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Oh, I thought since you brought up the question.
Well, there are many.
Hang on a second.
Oh.
We have both written on the subject.
There are many Christians and many Messianic Jews who don't feel that if you're a Gentile believer, that you should convert to Judaism formally. In fact, they would preach against converting to Judaism formally, even though conversion to Judaism in the wider Jewish community is really a normal and regular thing. It's fine. We have known Gentile believers who have formally converted to Judaism. And one of the things I think that people are afraid of is, like, if I go to the classes with the rabbi, with the other people who want to convert, and won't they make me sign a paper that says I don't believe in Yeshua? And the answer to that is maybe not, but probably not.
Possibly so.
Possibly so. But it's not automatic. And by converting, you are not saying anything about your relationship with Yeshua.
Now, within the Messianic movement, a group that we are affiliated with, the Messianic Jewish Rabbinic Council, has in fact put together a process, a procedure through which you could follow to bring you to the point of conversion. And that particular process is certainly as stringent as what you find in, more stringent than what you find in Reform Judaism, certainly as stringent as you find in conservative Judaism, and perhaps even bordering on Orthodox Judaism. So there is a process that you can undergo. But to enter that process, you have to go through a series of interviews so that those who are involved can be certain that you're doing it for the right reason. Number one, it needs to be something that is part of God's calling on your life. Number two, it needs to be something that you're going to commit to live by. I was going to say after conversion, and quite possibly start living that way even before conversion. In traditional Judaism, it is common, and is in fact expected of a rabbi who's approached by someone who wants to convert. It is expected that the rabbi turns the person desiring to convert, turns him away or her away at least twice in order to make sure that the person is really committed to becoming part of the larger Jewish community. There was one person who is no longer part of our synagogue. This is not the reason why this person's not part of the synagogue, who asked me, I think at least 4 times, if not more, about converting. And because I knew the person, and this was a very lovely person who was really helpful around the synagogue, because I knew the person and had a conversation with him, I refused, because I didn't think the person was coming at it from the right perspective. And this was not the reason for my rejecting him, but one of the reasons that people often think about converting to Judaism is because they feel that in some way, by becoming a Jew, you are closer to God. If you understand Judaism and practice it properly, it is a way in which you can draw close to God. But you don't become automatically closer to God because you're a Jew. You're no closer to God than a Gentile, and you're no further away from God than a Gentile. So if you're coming to convert to Judaism as a means of becoming more spiritual or more religious, or like I said, closer to God, or have a higher status, whatever, you will certainly not pass through the first round of interviews with the MJRC. And you certainly, if you were coming to us, you certainly would not get our encouragement. So I think that we pretty well covered it. Now, within our synagogue, however, I will say there are Gentiles who, for all practical purposes, live very Jewishly. And in fact, some of them, and you like to do this, some of them live more Jewishly than the Jews among us. And share with them your answer to a person who comes to the synagogue and asks who's Jewish.
The situation in our synagogue is, I would say 3 weeks out of 4, we have visitors. And visitors mean they have questions, they have assumptions. Like once a year, we used to get like a whole Sunday school class from a church would come and sit there. And it's like, well, to me, it was like awkward, it's like they're going to the zoo to see some animals. It's like you get that feeling of they're watching us to see how we do things and what we're doing. It's because we're so weird. So I just want to see. That's my problem. What was I going to talk about?
When they come and ask you the question.
Oh, so, and this has happened several times. They come over to me. Hi, is everybody here Jewish? And I go, no. Oh, who's Jewish? And I go, why don't you tell me who you think is Jewish? And that, because during a service, there'll be several different people who go up front for various reasons. And so they would start pointing out people, well, that woman there. And I go, no. What? Well, that guy there. No. And here's the thing, they're not horrified. They are shocked in a good way, because the assumption would always be, why would they do this? Why would they want to identify with Jewish people? And if they're a Jewish person who's a non-believer, they just can't believe any Gentiles are this interested. The Gentiles they know just want to avoid everything like this. They don't feel comfortable with it at all. So it is interesting when you, as I like to say, the proof of Jewishness is not DNA. Otherwise, we'd all be going to Ancestry and getting your DNA taken. But even when you watch the program on PBS, where they do take the person's DNA, and they have talked a lot about Jewish ancestry and Jewish history, and Americans that come from a Jewish background or don't come from a Jewish background. And they show the DNA. And you can't predict what someone's DNA looks like. Once again, the DNA test is not a good test. It is what do you do in your life that's Jewish besides eating bagels? Because it's just weak sauce to say, I'm Jewish, but I haven't done a Jewish thing in the last 30 years. But I'm here in this church, and doggone it, I like this church. But I'm a Jew and I'm in the church, and you're just going, okay, I hope that works for your kids. Because probably they're not going to be Jewish whatsoever.
Number of years ago, and unfortunately, I put my note on this aside somewhere, I have yet to recover it. Building on what Patrice said and on Seth's position. If I remember correctly, the Rambam, Maimonides, said something very similar to that. He said something similar to the idea that if a person lives as a Jew, then that person is a Jew. He went in, he had, that was a simple summary statement. He had more to say about that, obviously, but I think that very effectively summarizes the point that you're making.
Since you asked about God-fearers, so that's where the God-fearers do come in, because back in Second Temple times, and once again, believers who are not Jewish are usually taught wacky things that are crazy and not anywhere near true. But somebody told them this was true, and they don't know any Jewish people to find out for real. During Second Temple Judaism in the Roman Empire, synagogues were open for everybody. If you wanted to go to a synagogue on a Saturday, you could go to a synagogue on a Saturday, and they would not turn you away, and they will not ridicule you, or they won't make you stand up and say anything. And that's true about synagogues today too. Because I had some students in a couple of my classes, I said, you need to go to an actual synagogue outside of a Messianic synagogue. Oh, will they let me in? Yes, they will. In fact, they may be flattered. You're not there to preach at them. You are there to listen and learn. And so this was common in synagogues throughout the Roman Empire, because especially women, it says in history books, especially women were interested in Judaism because it had such high morals, high values, respect for life. And so it was normal that if you were interested in Judaism, you could go and you could become a regular visitor at the synagogue. And if you were, and you identified with the synagogue, even though you didn't formally convert, you were what's known as a God-fearer. And that's a technical term that you find in the book of Acts, which says Cornelius, who lived in Caesarea, was a God-fearer. When they say God-fearer, it does not mean that you had warm, fuzzy feelings about the God of Israel. Or you were walking along the street, you're a Gentile, walking along the street, and all of a sudden God speaks to you, and now you're God. That doesn't happen. It talks about these are Gentiles who would on purpose go to a synagogue, and you could join in at the synagogue, and that was normal. And you would learn about Judaism. In fact, that would be the only way you could learn about Judaism. There were no books or no pamphlets.
You mean they didn't have the Jewish catalog at that time?
No.
Oh, okay.
And so it's the historians say, oftentimes these people who spent some time at a synagogue and got to know what Judaism was like, they would go ahead and convert. That was normal. If they didn't convert, their children would convert. interesting. And it said for those who chose not to convert, I read a couple different things. Well, for men, it'd be shameful to have to get circumcised. This is written by a Gentile. It'd be shameful for a person to get circumcised, a man. So women didn't have as much skin in the game, shall I put it that way? I made a joke.
You made a joke.
They had no skin in the game. Women didn't, but men did. And sometimes they were afraid of, if they were in some kind of business, that it would make them, their business be unpopular. But where was I going with that? But anyway, that's where the idea of God fears. And when you read that in the Newer Testament, that is the people that they're referring to. These are not well-intentioned Gentiles who get it. Oh, I think I'm going to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob now. Let's see. I wonder how that worked. No, they would, if they're interested, go and learn about Judaism. And that's what they did. It's still possible today, although you won't be called God-fearing.
No. Speaking of God-fearers, thank you for setting up a commercial.
Okay.
If you want to read more about it, or read all about it, in the book that I edited called The Enduring Paradox, Patrice has a chapter on modern day God-fearers. It's very, very helpful. Check that out. A number of years ago, a Reform rabbi who was also a university professor, Dr. Daniel Cohen-Sherbach, wrote a book on Messianic Judaism, in which he argued the case for Messianic Judaism to be argued the case that Messianic Judaism was in fact part of Judaism. But then he also edited a book, and I can't remember the name of the book, and it probably has Messianic Jews or Messianic Judaism in the title, in which the book examined a variety of issues and had a person arguing on behalf of the issue and one arguing against the issue. Both Patrice and I have chapters in that book.
Which book is this?
I can't remember the title.
Give me more information about it.
I do remember that you and Tony, and I won't say more than that,
Tony Eaton. Oh, okay.
took different sides on the role of Gentiles in Messianic synagogues. I wrote the pro chapter on conversion, and I forget exactly who wrote. Yeah, I do know who wrote the against. So you can see the pros and cons of some of those things if you want to enter in that further. And I think, again, the title has Messianic Jews or Judaism in it, but it's a book that was edited by Daniel Cohen-Sherbach. It's not one he wrote. He may have written the introductory chapter. So both of those books will give you some more insights in more details on some of the stuff we've been talking about. And I got to remember what the title of that book is.
Sorry.
Okay. Any
You
questions?
could Google him.
Any questions from those of you who are here on this? For those of you whose faces we see on the monitor? Okay. Now,
I have a question.
yes.
Especially studying the epistles class and getting ready to take that test. In looking at Galatians and the argument there as to why a man should not get circumcised, which would prevent him from conversion, it almost sounds like Paul is opposed to converting to Judaism. How do you explain that?
Thank you. We did cover this in class, but thank you for bringing it out on the table here because that's very relevant to the question we've been talking about. To briefly summarize Galatians, and if you want a fuller summary of Galatians, I actually did an article or a series of articles on Galatians. Thank you. So thank you for setting me up for the commercial. I also did a journal article on Paul and his Jewish context. So some of these issues will be there in more detail. But let me say this about Galatians. And the same issue surfaced, in my understanding, after the book of Galatians was written in Acts chapter 15. And the question was, if you were going to have a relationship with God, must you become a Jew? And if you're following Yeshua the Messiah, in order to be fully connected to God, must you convert to Judaism? Please remember that in the discussions, in the letters, particularly in Galatians, but elsewhere, when circumcision is referred to, it implies not the physical act. It includes that, but it implies conversion to Judaism. Did he or did he not, he being the Apostle Paul, who was not known as the Apostle Paul when he was around, but Rav Shaul, he was a rabbi. What was his position on this? Well, when the issue came to the forefront, people who were arguing that to be a fully committed follower of Yeshua, you had to convert to Judaism. They were pressuring him to have Titus converted. And in keeping with what he teaches in the book of Galatians, he said, absolutely not. He does not have to be. But Rav Shaul did have Timothy circumcised. Now, people will go blathering on and on about he had a Jewish mother and a Jewish grandmother. But in that time period, remember, what was it that made you a Jew? Did you have a Jewish papa? And were you circumcised? Because that's the sign of being part of the covenant of Abraham, God's covenant with Abraham. So, because the rabbi understood that Timothy was going to be a very close, how should we put it, associate of his, as well as student of his, and since a lot of a major focus of Rav Shaul's ministry was going to be with Jews, I know that's not the way he's presented by most people teaching it, but for that, here's another commercial. You can't do it now because we just finished the course Thursday. Do take by distance the course Epistles from a Jewish perspective. Okay, so he has Timothy circumcised so that Timothy could be more effectively a functionary member within the Jewish community. That means that Timothy was converted to Judaism. Like it or not, for those who don't particularly like that perspective. And that was perfectly in keeping, ready, with the message he preached or taught in the book of Galatians. Because the issue in the book of Galatians was there were people who were coming from Jerusalem who were trying to teach the Galatians that if you're going to be a true follower of Yeshua, you had to be circumcised. In other words, you had to convert to Judaism. Later, the Acts 15 council would say that's not the case, but this is in all likelihood prior to the Acts 15 council. So he says, no, you don't have to be. Because conversion to Judaism, to get back to where we started this whole conversation, conversion to Judaism does not make you more special before God or more loved by God. If that's what the teaching is, then no, you do not convert to Judaism as these teachers did. And by the way, it appears from some of the material that's in the book of Galatians that these teachers may themselves have converted to Judaism as adults. And number two, weren't necessarily following the definition that Patrice and Seth gave you earlier. They weren't living fully Jewish lives because they weren't following the whole of Jewish practice. It was circumcision or conversion, and then a couple other things. But Rav Shaul in Galatians says explicitly in at least two places, these people are not following the whole Torah. In other words, they're not living Jewishly. Okay, so that's the role of the book of Galatians in this whole discussion. Barbara, thank you for bringing up that very important part of the discussion and for allowing me.
The part that I didn't really pay attention to was that Timothy would have actually not been considered Jewish.
That is
I
correct.
was thinking he was Jewish, and so I was
Because
seeing Jew and Gentile as different, and it just didn't register that, no, wait up, he would have been considered Gentile.
Yes.
Yeah. And so now I
Exactly.
understand better why a Gentile would be allowed to convert. Thank you.
You're more than welcome. And to put it into a very important part of Rav Shaul's background that surfaces in Acts 21 and following, if he had brought Timothy into the temple with him, that would have been completely okay. If he had brought Titus into the temple with him,
Not okay.
I was about to say, no, it would have been okay, but he could only go so
Go
far.
so far, yeah.
He couldn't go all the way in.
Yeah, that's another thing that I think Gentiles misunderstand. Is like, you couldn't go in the temple. You could go in the temple,
Yes.
but you could only go so far. But that's okay. If you weren't a priest, you could only go so far, even though you were Jewish. So I think, once again, it's like a straw man, that a straw person, that
Thank you.
they have the wrong definition and then they tear apart what they've created, which is the wrong definition.
Yeah. And in fact, Gentiles could offer sacrifices or have sacrifices offered on their behalf. But again, for more on that, epistles from a Jewish perspective. And Barbara, thank you for allowing me to get in there, not just one, but 3 different commercials. That's always appreciated.
On Shabbat.
And on Shabbat too.
It's getting dark though, so.
Yeah. All right. Then we have a series of very interesting questions, 3 very interesting questions, not necessarily interrelated,
No.
from a couple. And the questions have to do with burial versus burning, Moses' circumcision, and wise men following a star. Now, I am tempted to start with the last one because that's one of my hobby horses, but I'm not going to start with the last one. I will start with the first one because in one sense, it builds on the discussion we have had so far. What is the Jewish understanding or tradition concerning death and burial? Now, listen carefully because I want to give full attention to what is said. This husband and wife were discussing this topic. We have recently been talking about why Judaism prescribed burial versus cremation. I did a little bit of research online about the topic and found that in Devarim 21, that's Deuteronomy 21, 22 to 23, it says, hold on a second. If a person commits a sin punishable by death and is executed, and you hang the corpse on a tree, his body must not remain all night on the tree. Instead, you must make certain you bury him that same day, for the one who is left exposed on a tree is cursed by God. You must not defile your land, which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. The reason it gives is so that the land is not defiled. So what about a person who dies outside the land of Israel?
Uh-oh.
Okay. Secondly, we have the story in 1 Samuel 31, 11 to 13 that says, when the residents of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, that's as in King Saul, all their warriors set out and traveled throughout the night. They took Saul's corpse and the corpses of his sons from the city wall of Beit Shan and went to Jabesh, where they buried him. They took the bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh. Then they fasted for 7 days. That's the end of the quote. Here they actually burned off all the flesh and then buried the bones. In the Joseph story, we also see that Jacob was embalmed and then buried in Israel. And Joseph's bones were eventually taken to Israel and buried there. So we see a pattern of bones being buried in the land of Israel as the ideal. But it seems that there was not too much concern about what happened to the flesh before that. I know Jewish tradition has much more to say on the matter, and I'd like to hear a summary of what it says and why burial is so important. And then the follow-up question is if it really matters for non-Jews to be burned or versus buried. Okay, that's a whole bunch of stuff. We may not get through all of that today. And if we don't, we will bury it until the fall when we will resurrect it. Okay, now I use that, but what I just said is one of the lines of understanding in the Jewish tradition as to why you bury. Because with the idea of burial in Jewish tradition, there was the anticipation of a resurrection. They could not see within their cultural perspective if you burn this thing to a crisp
How can God?
and ashes, there are no bones to be resurrected. And in fact, the imagery for the great resurrection to come, Ezekiel 37, is what is found in that delightful, what they call spiritual, them bones, them dry bones. So it's related to that understanding. So in traditional Judaism, you get buried rather than cremated, because to some, if you are cremated, it's as if you're saying there is no resurrection to come. Whereas if you're buried, you are in fact saying, in effect, there is a resurrection to come, and I expect to be able to have a part in that. So that's the largest overriding thing in all of this. Now, let's try to parse this bit by bit. There's another understanding within Judaism, and I'm taking this now from the Joseph story, the third paragraph here. There's another understanding within Judaism, at least in ancient Judaism, that and this comes very clear in the story. I think it's in Genesis 23 of the death of Sarah. Chaya Sarah is the parsha. Why did Abraham make such a big deal about paying for the land in which Sarah would be buried? Because the understanding in those days was the land in which you were buried was the group of people, the community, or the nation with whom you were identifying. If this was land that was not Abraham's land, but was the land of the Canaanites, then in effect, what Abraham and Sarah were doing in her burial was identifying with the Canaanites rather than identifying with what would become the people of Israel. So that's the reason why, and in keeping with the promises God made, that both Jacob and Joseph insisted that their bodies, or at least their bones, be carried back to Israel so they'd be buried in the right place with the right community connection. And there's a very interesting midrash on Moses having trouble finding the bones of Joseph. And I believe I shared this with the synagogue a couple weeks ago. It's the story of the Exodus, and the people were getting ready to leave, and Moses was aware of the promise that was made to Joseph by his brothers, that when God brings them out of Egypt and takes them back to Israel. How's that for an amazing display of faith? That he made them promise that they would in fact take his body with him. So there's Moses. The people are packed up and ready to leave, and he's looking all over
They're taking Jacob too.
Yes, they're taking Jacob, but they can't find Joseph.
Yeah, they can't find his body.
They apparently know where Jacob is. They don't know where Joseph is. And he has spent 3 days, and in fact, the text might actually say 3 days and 3 nights. Another interesting reflection about finding somebody's bones and so forth, but that's a whole other story. Anyhow, so 3 days and 3 nights, can't find them. Then a Jewish woman comes to Moses and says, look, I know where you can find him. And so she takes Moses to where Joseph's bones are. And what Moses says, if I might paraphrase the text, it says it's much, much more neatly and nicely. Joseph, I want to see your bones, make them appear, or I'll just leave you here and we'll go on ourselves. And he gets the bones of Joseph. And then the bones of Joseph are taken along with. And in fact, the text somewhere in the teens in the book of Exodus tells us that the people of Israel took the bones of Joseph with them. So there's a question there about the idea of the flesh. And I think this impacts interrupt at any time, because some of this is now building the stuff you text you teach on.
What? I have no idea what.
Because we're now in the book of 1 Samuel.
Okay.
Anyhow, the story of Saul comes in here.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Saul and his sons didn't fare too well in this battle. It was the last battle they fought. And so their corpses were impaled
Outside of Beit Shan.
outside Beit Shan. By the way, a wonderful place to go to. The archaeological discoveries are amazing. We had a chance to watch them as it was developing. And who knows where it is now, some 8 years since we were last there.
Yeah.
So don't let the fact that Beit Shan is where they hung the corpses keep you from ever going to visit Beit Shan.
It's very, very interesting.
It is amazing. It is an amazing place. Anyhow, Beit Shan. So, based on the Deuteronomy text that was quoted earlier, Deuteronomy 21 verses 22 to 23, the idea of a body that's exposed is in some way defiling or polluting or I'm not sure what other terms to use here. It has to do with the idea of purity and impurity from a.
And also, probably also a question of shame.
Oh, I hadn't even thought of that, but that's correct. But the issue, the central issue is ritual purity or impurity. Okay? They weren't automatically impure or unclean in the sense of morally, because one of these characters that's out there is Jonathan. You might say that about Saul, but you wouldn't say it about Jonathan.
Yeah, Jonathan was killed in the battle.
Yeah, but the idea is any contact with a dead body, and in fact, we're now in the book of Vayikra or Leviticus, and some of those discussions take place, and in fact, maybe even part of the discussion for this week's Parsha, interestingly enough. It was viewed ceremonially or ritually as impure to come in contact with a dead body. And there are all kinds of reasons or lessons that might be taught from here, one of which is when you are exemplifying your status with God, your emphasis is not on death, but on life. For example, the book of Genesis was written not to show how life began, but to provide a reason for why death intervened. So it isn't about the story of the origin of life, it's about the story of the origin of death in a much larger perspective. So life is what characterizes relationship with God. So dead bodies picture the wrong thing. And if you come in contact with a dead body, then you have become ritually impure and you go through a process of cleansing, which includes eventually the ashes of the red heifer.
And there's also health considerations in general.
I was going to go there, but since you went there, go ahead.
Well, when you have catastrophes and you have dead bodies that are like laying around because they've been killed by the catastrophe, whatever it is, earthquake, hurricane, fill in the blank. Then you have an extreme problem with the likelihood of diseases like cholera, like typhoid fever, that then kill more people that were still alive can get from being in contact with dead bodies, these terrible diseases that it still happens nowadays. There's no perfect way to avoid getting these diseases depending on where you are and what has happened. And so it's not just a God thing. This is also to keep people safe from further destruction and further death. And I think that is an important part of this
Very
too.
important part.
It's not just it's not like, I think people see we tend to see that if God says, no, don't do that, that we're being deprived and it's not fair. Probably in the same way we consider about the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Yeah, there were reasons why you shouldn't do that. Well, why does he tell us? Then it would make more sense. And I don't like being told something I don't understand. Yeah, okay. And this is human beings, and they go on and on, unless you can explain it to them, and unless they're convinced, they're just going to do what they want. How did I end up here?
You were talking about
So dead bodies. You cannot
good thing
with dead bodies. There's you can get disease, and it's often guaranteed that in circumstances where you have a lot of dead bodies, you're probably going to get sick.
This just popped in my mind, completely in line with that. As Jews historically, we were accused of being the originators of the Black Plague.
Yes.
And the reason for that is because our communities survived it. Other communities didn't. The reason our community survived it is because we had these particular rules about purity and impurity, about contact with dead bodies or not contact with
And
dead
about
bodies.
washing your hands
Yeah.
before you eat.
So, yeah, so that's just an example of something that enabled our community to survive, and yet that was used against us because
It proves that
that somehow,
Satan was working through the Jewish
yeah,
people.
or that somehow we originated it as a plague on everybody else.
'Cause
So,
once again, Jewish people, we win because
so yes, so there was the idea of contamination, and by the way, and Patrice picks up on this in the Torah course, which, by the way, will be taught in the fall. So here's a commercial. And she will talk more about ritual, purity, and uncleanness and that whole package, because it's a multi-level, multi-layered kind of thing.
it's a
But
little complicated.
these guidelines that God gave had real life implications. Just to be very clear, God did not give them to us so that we'd be a healthier people. He gave them to us to communicate lessons, to teach us stuff.
And the health is also there.
And the health
That's
is,
the primary reason.
no, the health is a side effect.
A side benefit.
Side benefit, I like that better, is a side benefit of following God's ways. Too many people look at some of this stuff as, oh, you got to eat and live this way so you'll be healthier. Yeah, you'll be healthier if you eat and live this way, but that's not why it was given. It was given to teach lessons. And in fact, in somewhere in the last 20 to 25 pages of our Siddur, I talk about the lessons that are taught by the kosher rules. And they aren't, if I remember right, I'm not sure I even addressed the issue of health in there at all.
No.
Because that's not the main issue of the lesson being taught. Okay. Two other things that derive from this set of questions on burial versus burning. Number one, although the text specifically addresses this in conjunction with stuff that takes place in the land, it is not intended to be understood totally as only applicable in the land. In other words, the question was raised. So does that mean if we're not in the land, we don't have to follow these guidelines? No. In a broader sense, it is, yes, it certainly applies in the land because that's the home of the community, but it applies to wherever the community is a community. So it is not just land rules, but it's also community rules. So the primary, like I said, reference is to the land, but it implies, it's not limited to that, implies wherever Jewish people live and go as a community. Now, follow-up question is, does it really matter for non-Jews to be burned versus buried? No, it doesn't matter. And in a larger sense, it doesn't matter if a Jewish person is cremated or buried. It does communicate in some parts of the community certain things, and so some parts of the community may question it. But it does not mean that you may have lived as a Jew, you're not dying as a Jew. I mean, you died as a Jew, you may not have been buried according to this particular custom. I think that would be our response on this particular issue.
So is it okay to be cremated?
So yes.
As far as we know, it is.
As far as we know, it's okay to be cremated because after all, the God of the resurrection can resurrect, whether it's bones or skin or ash. And even if those ashes have been scattered across the ocean, like in some traditions or cultures, God can put them all back together again. I mean, he managed to, how should I put it? create the process by which subatomic particles could be put together into atoms, which atoms could be combined into molecules, molecules into cells, and cells into people and animals and all kinds of other things. If he could do that, he certainly can put together the ashes or whatever is left over of a dead person, in order to make sure that they are part of the resurrection. Okay. Takes a deep breath. Any questions on this?
Comment, I would have thought after the Holocaust that this wouldn't even be a question because, so many of the Jews were burned up. And I mean, what are we going to say? None of them come back alive? I mean, that's horrible.
Yeah.
Yes, and that has been certainly, as you well observed, and thank you for bringing that in. Again, very pertinent to what we're talking about. Very well observed. And so part of the discussion has had to be shifted because of that. Because, 6 million of us, I almost said went poof. Most of us did, in that one sense, go poof. Some people have estimated maybe closer to 7 million, but it doesn't matter. It's millions, and most of them turned into ashes. You can bet God's going to raise them. We had a good friend, who's no longer with us, who argued that each and every person, each and every Jew who died during the Holocaust was automatically qualified for life, eternal life with God afterwards. And she made a very good argument.
And she was very conservative.
And she was
Bible knowledge.
Oh yes, extremely conservative in all but a couple areas of theology. But she now knows the answer to her question, or how should I put it, her theological point.
And she was a Holocaust survivor.
Yes, she was a Holocaust survivor. And my guess is that when she got that ultimate answer, her original answer was positively fortified. So thank you, Barb, for adding that. That is a very important consideration. Okay. Dare we try another one?
Yeah, because we started late.
Okay. Since we started late, we'll go a little longer. And since this is the last one for the summer, I am going to bypass number 2.
Yes. We just talked sort of about it, but just not about that set of verses
Okay.
last time.
Yeah. We just so you know what to anticipate. No, we'll just leave it.
No.
It's titled Moses' Circumcision.
I was going to say circumcision part B because we talked a lot about circumcision last time.
Yeah. So we will postpone that till the end of the summer.
It's worth answering. Just
Oh,
not,
yes.
maybe not.
And it's got several layers of complexity, and hopefully I'm a pin, so I remember that this is.
No, I don't know what finger point
I'm
means.
sorry.
I'll get it for you.
Wise men following a star. In the nativity story, we have these wise men from the east bringing gifts. They were, let me check that off and check that off. Thank you. They were following a star that led them to Jerusalem, and then after speaking with Herod's wise men, I'm not sure I'd call them wise men. Anyhow, they determined they needed to search in Bethlehem for the newborn king. I guess we could call them wise men because they at least were
Advisors.
Advisors.
Well, Herod had advisors.
Yeah, at least these advisors knew where to send these people. Anyhow, first of all, how does a star lead you to Jerusalem? I don't understand how star navigation works, but I don't imagine it to be as precise as leading to a particular city. But then again, ships have used star navigation for ages to cross the oceans, so maybe it really is that accurate. Second, why did they believe that a star would lead them to the Messiah? I read once that Rabbi Akiva believed Shimon Bar Kokhba to be the Messiah and changed his surname from Bar Kokhba, actually probably Bar Kokhba, to Bar Kokhba, which means son of a star, because of Balaam's prophecy in Numbers 24:17. There seems to have been a somewhat common understanding that this prophecy was about the Messiah. I have no idea how they all came to that conclusion. To me, all the prophecies in the Bible seem ambiguous and impossible to interpret, but I'm no sage or rabbi. Third, who were these wise men? Were they Jews from the Babylon communities? Were they pagan prophets like Balaam? Were they foreign kings? Maybe they were from way, way east like China or Laos. By the way, he throws that last one in because that's where he was born. Not because he has some particular biblical insight, or maybe he does. And I love the way that this couple concludes this. That may be too much to address in one session of Stump the Stars, but that's fine. Okay, with his permission.
Just stick to the wise men. Right now.
We're going to stick to the wise men.
Wise guys.
And here we go. First of all, let me interject something. Some of the prophecies are very difficult to understand, and they become much clearer after the prophecy has been fulfilled. Some I'm going to suggest are not necessarily that difficult to understand. But you are always better off checking to see which prophecies are claimed to have been fulfilled, putting those prophecies on your list of prophecies that are prophecies you understand. Is that fair enough from the outset? But when Micah chapter 5, depending on which translation you're working with, verse 1 or 2 says, out of Bethlehem will come forth for me one who will rule over Israel. That seems pretty clear that since Micah is after David, this is not a reference to David, but to someone who was part of David's ancestry and ultimately called the Messiah. And that's why then this text is cited in the Newer Testament as one being fulfilled. I don't think that was so difficult. And I think, and another reason for saying that was not so difficult is, look, back to Herod's advisors. They were, if I remember right, they might have actually been scribes. They certainly were able to say to these people looking for, and remember these people who came, let's call them the Magi. The Magi who came were looking for Israel's king, which is why they went to Jerusalem, because that was the capital city of Israel's king, Herod. That was not a good idea if they had known much about Herod. But Herod's advisors or the scribes said, no, if you're looking for the king that you are looking for, go to Bethlehem. Why? Because they understood Micah 5, 1 or 2, depending on what it was in their particular text. Is that fair enough? 4 more. And thank you, lovely couple, for setting me up for a commercial. God willing, this time next year, spring semester, I will be teaching Messianic apologetics. And doing Messianic apologetics, we spend a great deal of time on the prophecies, both those fulfilled and those unfulfilled. We spend less time on that in one of the other courses, but we'll get into that. So that's a commercial for more on the idea of prophecy. All right, now, star navigation. Many people have pointed out exactly the question that this couple raises. How could a star lead you to a specific location, not just in Bethlehem, but in fact to a building in Bethlehem? That must have been some star. Now, the way in which this is described is not necessarily described as a star. It is some kind of light that they followed. And somehow this light actually moved in a way that was helpful to them. Some say it was a comet. Some say it was a constellation of stars. Some say it was some other kind of heavenly body. I would say most heavenly bodies, including stars, are basically eliminated from the way the trajectory of this particular body of light took. Who knows? At the end, it could have been a meteorite. So a meteorite landed then just outside the inn in Bethlehem. I doubt that too, because a meteorite is not up there for so long that it would have enabled these people who came from the east to take the 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it would have taken them to get there. So some kind of light. Was it an angel? Who knows? When we see the, I was going to say the videotape, but we no longer use videotape. When we see the DVR of this event, then we'll go and look and say, oh, that makes sense. Until then, we don't have an answer to this one. Okay? Somehow it led the Magi to Bethlehem, just as the scriptures indicated that this would be the place where the Messiah would be born. Now, I mentioned that they probably took a couple or 3 weeks getting here. First of all, there aren't necessarily 3. They had to be at least 2, and it could have been a whole lot more than 2.
Well, and it could have been a party of people.
It could have been a party of people. We don't know how many. So the tradition about 3 comes later, and it's built on that 3 specific gifts are named. That didn't mean that only one person could bring one of these gifts, and therefore you had 3. So let's set that aside. They came from the east. There is a strong tradition within early Christianity that the wise men or the Magi showed up about 2 weeks after Yeshua's birth. And so we have the Christmas carol, the 12 Days of Christmas. That's a fairly strong tradition. Traveling by camel and being on a mission that was really propelling them, it would not have been very difficult at all for these people to have made this journey in 2 weeks. Okay, some people think that it took them 2 years to get there because when they show up in Luke chapter 2, no, when they show up in Matthew chapter 2, the term that's used isn't necessarily a term for an infant, and the argument is made, quick aside, as in English, so in other foreign languages, you have things called synonyms. Just because synonyms are used doesn't mean that the 2 words distinguish 2 different things or people. I was frequently told when I used to hack away at English composition in high school, stop using the same word, use a synonym. That's good writing style. For those of you who've been involved in writing, you understand that full well. Anyhow, so Herod had everyone under the year of every male in Bethlehem under 2 years old killed. So they must have arrived when the child was 2 years old. No, this is Herod you're dealing with. You're dealing with Herod near the end of his life. Herod wasn't always that well put together, and by the end of his life, he was not well put together at all. What he's going to do is he's going to push the boundaries to make sure he covers all his bases. So just because Herod said 2 and under.
He's just trying to hedge his bets.
Exactly.
Make sure everybody gets taken care of.
Exactly. So they showed up probably, according, as the tradition points out, a couple weeks after Yeshua's birth. All right, now that we got that far, and we got star navigation, what about the role of a star in prophecy? Numbers 24:17 is in fact mentioned. You remember the author of that particular prophecy, Balaam. And I love describing him because he's a dude who not only talked to his donkey, he lost a debate with his donkey. That tells you something about him. But apparently he had notoriety as a prophet. And so in stark contrast to what he was paid to do, which was to call down a curse on the nation of Israel as it was as it was walking with God in the wilderness. And by the way, quick aside for another hobby horse of mine, this strange prophet, given those credentials, saw that God was with this group of people. These people were walking with God. And that's why we have part of our liturgy. Ma tovu o halakha, how Beautiful are your tents, O Israel, your dwelling places, O Israel, O Jacob. This is the dude who uttered those because he recognized what was going on there. Too often teachers don't recognize what was going on there. But back to this. So he says, a star will rise in Jacob, a scepter to rule Israel. Prophecy is frequently poetic. And in Hebrew poetry, as in some other forms of poetry as well, when you have parallel lines, they're intended to be parallel lines to describe the same thing, not to describe two different things. So the star is in parallel with a scepter. What's a scepter? It's in those days, it was for lack of a better term, the decorative staff that a king or queen would use to rule as a sign.
Royal scepter.
The royal scepter. In other words, he's saying that a king will rise in Israel or in Jacob. That's pretty clear. The king that would arise is, of course, as we come to know it later, part of the line of the great King David. So this would take place. God would raise up a king over Israel. God did raise up a king over Israel, although he's not ruling over Israel at this point. It was David's greatest descendant. So yes, that is why they went to Israel to look for the king, because they had seen some sort of star or some sort of atmospheric event in the night skies. Okay. How would they even have known of this prophecy? Well, as it turns out, Balaam came from the part of the country they came from. And given Balaam's reputation, some of what he said would probably be passed on from generation to generation. So there would be no reason why they would not have been aware of this particular prophecy that Balaam left behind. There's another reason that they were probably aware of this prophecy, and that has to do with the third question in this package. Who were these wise men, the Magi? Were they Jews from the Babylonian communities? Geographically, yes, and I would argue, given the context here, yes as well. They would have been aware of the prophecies because the prophecy is recorded where? In the Torah. So they would have known the Torah. So in all likelihood, these were people who were probably significant, given the way they're described, if not advisors in a king's court, they were significant noblemen from, in all likelihood, the Babylonian court, or the Babylonian area. Why were they in Babylon? Well, remember, a good chunk of our people were carried off into Babylon during the second captivity. And many of them remained there. So there would be thriving Jewish communities there. How do we know? Because the classic edition of the Talmud is called the Babylonian Talmud. That was written by the Jewish scholarly communities in the area, what was known as Babylon. Okay. So they, as Jewish wise men or magi or scholars, would have been looking for the star to indicate that the king was finally coming on the scene. How would they know when to look for this star, one might ask? Well, there was he wasn't officially a prophet, but a person of prophetic character, another one who lived in Babylon. His name was Daniel. And in Daniel chapter 9, and we'll talk about this in Messianic Apologetics, in Daniel chapter 9, toward the end of the chapter, he gives a timeline for when the Messiah would show up. So being familiar with the prophecies, Daniel was part of the Babylonian court. If these people were as well, that tradition would have been passed on very clearly also. They would have known about when to look for the star. And then all of a sudden they see this thing in the heavens and they say, now's the time. And they don't take a year and a half to gather up their belongings to get out there. They pack up their camels right away and they start riding. So that's our story of the Magi, or the wise men, following the star. And they came to greet the king who was considered the Messiah. How do we know? Because Akiva in the 2nd century addressed this appended this messianic title to the person who was at least partially successful in the second revolt against Rome. Bar Kokhba was able to rule Israel for 3 years, 132 to 135. That's how successful he was in the revolt against Rome. And so Akiva says this guy is then obviously the Messiah. And so he addresses a messianic title to the person who became Bar Kokhba, Simon. That in itself is another example of the fact that these prophecies can be understood. They're not so ambiguous, because the Rabbi Akiva certainly understood that this was a messianic prophecy. And so he associated with the one who was at first successful in that second revolt. Yes,
I have a question.
certainly.
It might be a dumb question.
The only dumb question is one that's not asked.
No, this might be dumb, whether. So, okay. Do we know where Yeshua was circumcised?
Yes,
In the temple?
yes.
Then, all right,
Luke chapter 2.
okay, all right. Then they were in Bethlehem. He gets born. A week later, he gets circumcised. They come back to Bethlehem to see them. They did?
Yes, and
Why would they do that?
that's part, well, okay, good questions. First of all, part of the nativity story misunderstands it and thinks that Yeshua was born in a manger. That's misunderstood because
Mary wouldn't fit in a manger.
the term that's used there in Greek, I forget that, it slips my mind right now. It's a term that does not refer to manger, but it's a reference to the guest room. There was no room. Pardon me, it does not refer to an inn. There was no room in this particular house because the guest room was occupied. So they did in fact put them in what we would call a manger. A place.
Now, to me, the
Yes.
manger is that little wooden
Yeah.
thing that they put the hay in, or they put the
Yes.
corn in. But the manger's not the room.
No. This was really reinforced for us many years ago when we were in the home of our good friends, the late David Stern and wife Martha, in Jerusalem.
David Stern of the Jewish.
And as they were enlarging their home, which is an older home, they uncovered something on the ground level. The home was a couple levels up, and on the ground level, they found the remains of what you would call a barn, or a place where sheep would be kept.
Animals of any kind
Animals of any
during
kind.
the winter.
So that was, to me, a perfect visual example then of what Luke 2 was talking about. One, it wasn't an inn. It was,
Cave.
well, first of all, it was a home,
It's a home and there's a cave.
and there's a cave of some sort associated with it. And what would have happened, because the guest room was full, if you were, back up more context, they were in Bethlehem, why? For the census. You are to go back to your family's home. So they showed up at their family's home because she's pregnant, very far pregnant. They knock on the door. Unfortunately, the guest room's already been occupied. So they find this very good place, comfortable place for the baby to be born. What's going to happen the next morning? The people occupying the guest room will have said, oh, you guys need to come up here. So when the Magi appear, they appear to that home, the home of their family. I'm going to suggest that 8 days after birth, neither Mary nor Joseph would have been ready to travel. So they would have returned nearby. Bethlehem is not far from Jerusalem.
No, it really isn't. It's a half a day's journey.
If that.
I think with the donkey, it would be
Yeah.
half a day.
So they would have they would have been back in their the convenient guest room, which is where,
After several hours.
yes, and that's where the Magi would then have appeared. And who knows how long they would have stayed there. Matthew 2 tells us how long, but not in days.
If they don't go back to Galilee,
Mm-mm.
they go directly to
Egypt. An angel shows up and says to Joseph, it's time for you to pack up. Only I want you to head for Egypt. And why not go back home? Because this dude Herod is still going to be on the lookout. And when he finds out how old this kid of yours is, and if he finds out where he was born, there won't be too long for this kid's life. So they get sent off to Egypt, and you have that whole Egypt connection, which is a whole wonderful other connection that's forms part of the background, the Mosaic background of the Gospel of Matthew. And for that, you would have needed to take the course from the fall, the Gospels in their Jewish context. So there's our manger story, our Magi story. We don't know how long they would have been there. Interestingly enough, I will say this, and we'll conclude unless there's further to add to this. If Yeshua was born on the first night of Hanukkah, as the text seemed to indicate, when would he have been circumcised?
last night.
The last night, the eighth night of Hanukkah, when the Hanukkahs would be in full bloom or blossom or whatever term you want to use. And against that background, now read Luke 2 in the way in which the family was greeted in the temple by Hannah, whom we mentioned last night, and by Shimon or Simeon, who called him at that point in time the light to lighten the nations and the glory of God's people Israel. Against the background of the Hanukkah, what better context would you have had? Okay, so interesting questions from a variety of different areas. Any questions on what we just covered? No, do you have anything further to add?
No, I just needed to get I thought he was taken to the temple, and then I needed to get that he came back to
Yes,
Bethlehem.
yes, because they do not show up in Nazareth until Herod is dead,
Yeah, when they come back from Egypt.
when they come back from Egypt. Yep.
And then I know the way they would have come, which you can find out if you take my geography course.
Yes.
I know the way they would have returned from Egypt.
And she will not only show you, but you might even get to trace it on your own map.
Well, if you take the course, you
If you
would.
take the course, yes.
There was a predictable way that you would get from Egypt to Galilee. Very predictable, very normal. This is the way everybody went, unless you had relatives and needed to go in the interior by the Mediterranean Sea. And there's an interchange where you get off the highway and go to Nazareth.
Yes, so you would have seen the signs, exit to Nazareth.
Cities north, this way, Nazareth, this way.
All right. No other questions? All right, then again, thank you for your attention. Thank you for your patience. Always good to see you. Let's sign off, and then, God willing, we will be back again. Same bat time, same bat location, as they say, come the fall.
Who knows when that'll be?
Who knows? We'll let you know. All right.
Thank you.
You're
And
welcome.
have a Shavua Tov, a good one.
And you as well.
You too.
All right, let's pray and we'll conclude.
Avinu Malkeinu, our Father and our King, we thank you that we're able to gather together and talk about your word and learn things and really able to discuss things so they're meaningful to us. And so they'll fit in our memories too, that we can take them with us as we go through our lives. Thank you for giving us minds to question, for giving us sources we can find answers. Father, you're very good to us, and we never want to take you for granted. Be with us this week and this summer. Be with us, be with our families and loved ones. We're entrusting our safety and our path to you. We pray that you would show us the footsteps you want us to follow, and that we would return together back in the fall when we look forward to celebrating your most holy holidays. Thank you for all the things you do for us each day. B'Shem Yeshua, Meshachenu, in the name of Yeshua, our Messiah. Amen.
Amen. And quick prayer request, I will be traveling to Berlin, be there for June 6th to the 9th for a couple special tasks. So I would appreciate your prayers on my behalf. Okay,
Especially now you have your new passport, so you're lucky.
yes.
Thank
All
you
right.
so much. I'm gonna
Thank
miss you
you.
guys this summer.
Well, we'll miss
We'll
you,
miss you.
but you know,
Even-
you always tune in on Fridays anyhow.
Yeah, you
So
can.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Yes, you can see us.
definitely.
Have a happy birthday.
Thank you.
why, thank
Thank
you.
you. Yeah, him.
Well, you too
Mhm.
before over this.
Well, I
weekend.
know, but his
Yeah,
is in about 10 days.
all right.
Good
Signing
night.
off.